Welcome to Conversations with Peter Boghossian, my co-host Christina Buttons. We are interviewing the most illustrious scholar, Wilfred Reilly. How are you today, Dr. Reilly?
Doing very well. Good to be back on.
Good to see you again. So tell us, what have you been up to, sir?
Well, I've been doing a couple of different things. I actually, Christina and myself and a couple other people might work on a project involving gender. But in the summer, I try to write a fair amount. I work at a state college, so we teach, as you know, usually a 3 and 3 or something like that suite of classes. So during the year, I'm pretty busy teaching, shaping young minds. So in the summer, I don't do that at all. I'm actually trying to work out this summer and get reasonably back in shape. But other than that, just writing like 2-3 hours a day, maybe a little more, seeing friends. I'm doing some travel this summer. But the big thing was the book behind me. I'm a capitalist, so we've got this guy, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, whatever, you see most of it. That is the most recent project, and that came out. That's my first major press book. That came out with HarperCollins just now, basically. I mean, that dropped a couple days ago. And it's doing pretty well. So we'll see. We'll see what happens with that. We'll see if it becomes a bestseller, which is the goal this week.
I'm super excited to read it. It looks
Thanks,
great.
I'll have my team send both of you guys a copy. Actually, you're on the list of people that should get one, but I don't know if we sent those out yet. I only got my author copies a couple of days ago. But I guess I could just stop being lazy and just fucking sign them. I've got a box of like 50 of them sitting in my living room.
Oh, that'd be great. Before you go on, I just want to ask you a couple of questions before we open up this crazy can of worms. What are you doing to get in shape?
What am I doing to get in shape? Well, a good buddy of mine, Brooks Crenshaw, used to be he was a tech, but on the SEAL teams overseas. And I myself used to be a sort of D2 or D3, but college level athlete as a runner. So, I mean, we're just doing the stuff we used to do back when we were in shape. So, I mean, we're working out Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. I mean, like Thursday would just be kind of an upper body weights day. I mean, you're doing bench, then you're doing the different pull down, lateral, like chest flexing exercises, doing sit-ups, like leaning over different machines, lifting weights in different directions. Friday would be more legs. I mean, I'm trying to get back into running again. So when you start on machines and run for X amount of time, then we normally will do at the end of the workout, like an hour outside, just moving in different ways. In between there, I mean, different leg stuff like dids, squats. And I mean, Saturday is various, like sparring and so on, just so you don't get bored with it. You do different stuff.
What kind of sparring?
I mean, like I used to box. I used to do some Shotokan. I wasn't extraordinarily good. I didn't like progress through like the belts hierarchy with great rapidity. But I mean, his was, I guess, be sort of Krav Maga, just whatever the military style was, like kill it, harm to the other person. My boy Daryl Pinto was I forget what his exact style of karate was, but he is, several Dan black belts. So he'll sometimes stop by and provide some tips on that.
Cool.
So just, I mean,
so let me ask you another question, and just so I can get. I don't like the stuff to be resident in my mind. So it prevents me from focusing on the conversation. So you're a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, right?
No, actually, I'm not. No.
I thought you were. You're not?
No, I'm very friendly with them. My only formal think tank affiliation is with, well, there are two. 1776 Unites, which is kind of the Black social science response to 1619. I was one of the people that helped found. Just because, frankly, as I guess a Black businessman, I thought that a lot of the nonsense on the minority side of the fence was making us look stupid. So I was one of a number of people who, along with Bob Woodson, Glenn Lowry, so on, helped put that together. And we still meet we have a kind of Illuminati style phone calls every so often. Like, should we do anything about this? Brothers. Carol Swain's a member of that group. And I also was one of the members of FAIR for a while when that got started. And I've recently had some conversations about, would you come back on our board of directors after, some internal questions. But no, I've gone to Manhattan Institute events and I've spoken there. I've never been formally asked to, in terms of a package or in terms of a number of articles or anything like that, to come on board.
Yeah, I think you'd be a great fit for them. I mean, the reason I asked is because when you said you teach 3-3, I was going to ask why you don't just ask someone to buy you out for 1-1 or maybe even 2-2.
I mean, at a certain level, I could probably do that without false modesty. I mean, one reason is that I like to teach. That actually, I've had a lot of questions about why I don't just stop teaching. I mean, I still invest. I'm not terrible at it. I mean, my books all did pretty well. I'm not rich in the sense that I would think of in those terms, like, you know, 7 figures year by year or anything like that. But I mean, I could probably mostly do what I wanted, which is actually one reason that I'm not terrified by the prospect, I guess, of firing. And I mean, I would hope and think, Peter, you would probably be in a similar position. Like, there's a level of fluidity that comes with that.
Yeah.
But, you know, I actually like teaching. Like, if I just wanted to, you know, make reasonable money and talk trash online, I mean, I could probably go back to Chicago and work for one of those companies like Marcus Evans or whatever would rehire me as the director of this region. And, you know, I don't think they check on my Twitter, but the idea of helping kids learn methods and so on is, I enjoy it. It's a job.
So last thing, and then we'll delve into your idea space. I'm just going to throw an idea out to you. So if you like teaching and you think you can buy yourself out for 1-1, here's my unsolicited advice, might be too strong, but idea for you. You ask your department chair to give you a large class, a very large class with 1 or 2 TAs, and then 1 seminar in which you teach your whatever your pet boutique project is. And then you buy yourself out for the other 1-1. Then you still get teaching, and the TA frees you from grading. And then you can spend more time writing or working out or doing whatever you want to do. So it seems like the best of both worlds. So I just wanted to say that because it was just on my mind.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting idea. I do think one of the things with that might be, I can see my department chair, who's a big former police major in Kentucky, kind of laughing at that, because we're becoming more popular, but we're a smaller department in a mid-sized state college. We've got maybe 40 majors or something like that. So, I mean, I do think that if I said, well, I'm not teaching these small methods classes anymore, I'm only going to teach courses that have, you know, X number of people in them, I don't know how many classes that would be possible for. So for us, I mean, generally, one of the things that's kind of interesting, and I think that this is one of the reasons for the people listening who maybe have a kid who's a sophomore in high school, who themselves are like a college junior, this is one of the advantages of a smaller school. I mean, K-State has maybe, counting online students, 4,000 students. So, I mean, all of our professors are actually professors. Like, we're at the level where the faculty are still quite good, but we're also, you're not going to have that many TAs in the classroom. So, like, our Africanist, Emmanuel Amadife, is just a guy who came here from Nigeria and, you know, publishes repeatedly on the continent. And if you take that track, you're going to get to go to his classes and, you know, talk back and forth with him. And it's the same thing with me. So, I mean, each semester I teach our con law class, I teach our research methodology class, and, you know, every so often we trade off who gets almost stuck in American government, which is the freshman seminar. So if you come in, it'll just be, you know, me or him or Fred, who was a major or above in the police force. It'll just be that guy in a suit. So, I mean, it's as long as I want to stay there and teach, there's probably going to be a pretty similar workload, which I don't mind. It's just part of the job. I mean, there are some inquiries that I've gotten from kind of colleges on the newer, more innovative model. Would you be interested in coming to, you know, the University of blank, you know, where we're challenging the hegemony of this older model and teaching? And I haven't accepted anything yet, but that'd be very interesting. I think about doing that. Yeah,
well, I appreciate you clarifying that. I want to delve into the idea space now, but I've never really spoken. We've spoken a lot, but we've never really spoken about your actual job. We've always spoken about issues and content, and I was very curious, and I'm sure other people would be curious too. So tell us. You said you write 2 to 3 hours a day. What do you write about, and specifically, what is your project with Detransitioners with Christina? If you guys could speak about that, that would be great.
Okay, well, Christina should probably actually take the lead on that. I mean, I'd be mostly looking at methods and how IRB would work with that and so on. But I mean, in terms of what I write about, a bunch of different things. Like, I'm a columnist for National Review, so I'm actually, and I've been a bit lazy on this finishing up the book. I'm getting them in every couple of weeks, but I really should be writing for them once a week or more. But I mean, I write about a range of topics, mostly involving kind of statistics and how they apply to society. But I mean, one of my first column for them was about the quote unquote increase in mass shootings. And my point was that there wasn't really an increase in mass shootings. We've just sort of changed the definition of mass shooting. First, we moved it from 4 or more killed to 3 or more killed under President Obama. And then we've seen an attempt by activists to define a mass shooting as 3 or more people shot, or in some cases even shot at in a gunfire incident. So that's how you get this claim that there are 1,000, every town in the USA, there are 1,000 or more mass shootings annually and so on. That's just like someone shooting your gun. The number of actual mass shootings, unprovoked killings of 4 strangers, that's been very stable for a very long time. And you see a weird pattern where both the alt-right and the hard left love the new mass shooting definition. Because if you just count some random gangbanger bucking shots into a crowd, one, you have a ton of mass shootings, but also you can play games with these numbers. Like you can say mass shooters are, 58% black, I think the total was. So you can pull any set of numbers into any debate. And that's one of the things I often write about for NRO. But I mean, my next column will probably be on like the magical N-word, where, I mean, people have their magic words in society today. So if someone says nigger in a video, they can become like a hard right superstar sort of, but also people will threaten to kill them. Like what is this as versus pop culture in the 1990s where people just sort of said, oh, well, that's mildly rude and then moved on with their life. So I write one of those roughly every 9 days or whatever it is.
You also did a great piece a few years ago about the sort of the myths surrounding the trans genocide and how a lot of those numbers are really kind of inflated to contribute to this narrative that, trans people, when they step outside, they're going to get murdered.
Oh yeah, that was probably my most, thanks for bringing that up. That was probably my most downloaded or most commented on NRO column. Yeah.
Nobody's tackled that before.
Yeah, well, I think a few feminists have mentioned it before, but without like this sort of like wonkery that I think you or I would throw in, like, I'm going to look at the murder rate for blacks and poor whites. And like, there were like 7 groups in the article. But yeah, the whole trans genocide thing, the Human Rights Campaign every year breaks down the number of trans people that die in violent homicide. And you never want anyone to be murdered, but it's 31 or something like that. And because we've seen such an incredible expansion of the percentage of people that define themselves as queer, I actually one day just took out Stata and just a calculator, because this isn't tough math. But I looked at like, how does that compare to the number of people in poor white communities, like where I live, black communities, whatever, women who suffer actual domestic violence from male partners that are killed? And it wasn't close. Like trans people had one of the lowest homicide rates of all groups, because it's this actually not very lower income on average, like seen as a bit odd, kind of socially isolated group of, I mean, honestly, big men to some extent, the majority, like they just weren't getting killed very often. So you could isolate any group and say, well, there's a Puerto Rican genocide. You could say that more easily than you could for almost any other group, by the way. And you could create this national campaign. And that's what the trans movement was doing. But like 30 over, I think it was 2.98 million was a tiny number. And I said, okay, you multiply that by 10. Not everyone's out. It still doesn't mean anything. So that column drew a lot of backlash, but I also think it caused, given the readership of NRO and the people that were sharing that commentary and so on, I also think it did make some people pull back and say, hey, we might not need a law around this. This probably isn't a major national problem.
What's interesting is a lot of narratives we hear from gender activists are kind of like contradictory. So at the same time that, this trans genocide is going on and, people can't walk outside without getting killed, is, societal acceptance is the reason why there's so much more people feeling safe to come out now, as especially young adolescent girls coming out as transgender because of societal acceptance. So it's like, which one is it? Yeah. They both try to push each of those narratives.
No, totally. So I often say, like, I'm not a pre-modernist, like get those women back in burqas, and I'm not a post-modernist where like nothing means anything. I'm actually just sort of a boring modernist. Like I wear a tie a lot. Like I'm a Popperian in terms of science. So like you can test things empirically. So like if you say that greater acceptance is the reason more people are coming out as trans, you would expect that to be very general. For example, you would expect that across age groups,
older people, across the age groups, but it's just concentrated in the young population.
No, that's exactly right. You and Colin have said this, like professionally, like, yeah, if it was just like, if you thought the cause was like porn or gender bullshit in schools or something, or BS in schools, you would expect that certain groups, like weird guys who are online a lot or like younger teens, would really show a prevalence of this, whereas older people wouldn't. And that's exactly what you see, by the way, like to giving
Yeah.
the game away. If you thought that the reason was just greater acceptance, you would expect across all clades, like more people coming out. You'd expect it more concentrated among older people who face the worst repression. That's not at all what you see.
Mhm.
And I've
Yeah.
never seen anyone just formally test that in a paper, but it should be very easy to do. So no, I don't believe that. I don't believe that. There obviously are forces in society that even if you're someone arguing on the other side of the debate table from us, you can't just dismiss. So there obviously is a power or an attraction that we've given to victimization in the recent past.
Yeah.
So if you see that the majority of people who are identifying as like fun and polyqueer or something are upper middle class white women, you could probably draw some conclusions from that. If
Yeah.
you see that the majority of people that are identifying as boys who are girls have previous mental problems or have been the victims of sexual abuse or something, like, they're really obvious conclusions you can draw from that. And people seem to be just openly shying away from that and saying, well, no, there were always, 5% of people were always transgender. They've just been repressed for all of history, like in ancient Greece and societies where it doesn't make sense. And now they're free. I don't think that makes any sense.
No. And it's mostly transgender too is sort of like a culture dependent
Oh yeah.
concept too, where you don't see it in other cultures. Well, they say you do, but their definition is different than it's gender nonconformity is generally what you see across cultures, but it's only in like this Western society that you see people medicalizing.
Yeah, I think that's correct. So like it's a culture bound syndrome. Yeah.
Right.
Now
Exactly.
this gets into one of my like long windy theories, which is that almost no ultimate moral rules exist at all, except for maybe the 12 universals in anthropology, like don't eat people. And even those are flexible in times of tension. So like most of the other rules we just, I mean, I'm bantering a little, but that's true. But like most of the other rules we just sort of make up. Like different cultures will encounter the same syndrome, which is real. Like there are feminine men who enjoy the company of women, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. But like how you interact with that, you can either say, oh, that's just a warrior that's kind of feminine. That's probably been the most common historical view. Or you can say, well, that's Prince, which is what we said until recently in the USA. Like there's certain symbology we attach to that, but it doesn't matter. Or you can say, no, that is a literal, real woman. And almost no culture before our modern culture has said that is a literal, real woman. And like there are ways to measure that. Like if there's a lodge in your town for ministrating women who are dealing with domestic issues, like if you're a man with long hair, can you go in there? No. Like there are actual practical things you could look at. Like we're Boghossian Native Americans who are people who are often gay and who wore beautiful jewelry and so on. Like were they thought of as women or were they just male fighters who dressed that way? You could check things that they could do and couldn't do in the village. Like did they have to go to war? And no, they were not considered to be actual females. No previous society, I forget who said this, but no previous society has ever said men can get pregnant. I think that's where we're cutting the bar. It's a little different.
Yeah, and that manifests differently. For example, travesti in Brazil is very different, and Reed will pull that up. That book made a profound effect on me. From 1998, if you haven't read it, it's worth it. So so when you say it's a culture-bound syndrome, I wrote about that in my first book. There's this thing called Koro, in which people from Southeast Asia believe their penises are retracting into them. When you say this is a culture-bound syndrome, the reason, and I just want to make sure I'm clear, the reason that you're saying that is because it affects certain age cohorts differently?
Well, what I'm saying when I say it's a culture-bound syndrome is that the way we react to the phenomenon of somewhat feminine males is unique to our culture. And that phenomenon is itself culture dependent. So the basic reality that there are men who are somewhat feminine as an individual society defines femininity, that itself is not debatable. I mean, and the Spartans and the Athenians wrote about this, that there were people who were, good traders or diddly fighters, things that are traditionally more male coded, but who were gay or who enjoyed wearing rich brocade, which the Spartans looked down on, or something like that. But those people just got teased slightly for being kind of feminine and then got on the warship. I mean, there was no idea that this made them female. There were other, I mean, when you talk about travesti in Latin America, there are other societies that have a label for this and that flex some feminine norms a bit for these men. But I think that we're the first society, at least that is a pretty competent political scientist who dabbles in anthropology as a hobby, but that I've ever read about who decided that feminine men were women. Like, I think that's pretty fair to say. So, like, the gender sex thing itself is interesting. Not to go on a whole long ramble about this, but like, gender is a fair enough. I mean, I can, I guess. But like, gender is essentially the somewhat sexist norms we associate with sex. One of the things that's kind of interesting is that as a guy who grew up in one of the country's like 5 largest cities in the 90s, I mean, most of the people I dated through college would have identified as feminists. And one of the big things in feminism at the time was that other than perhaps aggression or size, most male and female norms were at least 50% socially coded. Like, we kind of made them up. So like raver girl feminism was very much about like, we don't have to do this. Like, I don't have to shave my legs twice a week, or I don't have to always be feminine, or I don't have to be softer and nicer. Like, if I'm playing varsity basketball in college, that doesn't make me any less female. And I always thought that was pretty healthy. But gender basically is taking the male and female coded norms and saying, if you are more than 80% male coded, you are a man. That's all gender is. It's saying that the secondary traits associated with sex represent a distinct category apart from sex that's more important than sex itself. And again, that's entirely socially coded to the modern West. Like, no other society, as far as I can tell, has ever done that. And the response to that, I suppose, is that that's not real. That sex is a very simple biological thing, and the amount of value that you attach to gender can vary totally. Without being too glib about this, I don't attach any value to gender at all. I don't really think it makes much sense as a concept. Something I've said, I don't think I've said this on this show before, but I actually took one of the major gender scales, and you can find this on my Twitter account. I think Christina's seen it and made fun of it, like a lot of other people. But like, there's this whole thing, like, are you a boy or a girl? This is it's the primary youth gender scale. I forget what it's called. But there's a series of 4 questions in a row asking whether you prefer cats to dogs, how you feel about cooking, how you feel about gardening, are you comfortable with oral sex? And I forget what the other one was, how you interact with people in your friendships, like, will you listen to them at length? And I answered all these questions honestly. And I went from like being very masculine, because I'd answered other questions about violence and working out, to being a woman. They were just straight up like, you're a girl. And I thought this was hilarious. Like, I took the rest of the scale and I went back to being a guy. But that's what gender means. That's what I mean by this being culture bound. And I think I lost the original question a bit here, but I'm not sure that's an idea that inherently has a whole lot of value. It's just the original sort of 1970s stereotypes returning under a different guise.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of one of the problems we're seeing now today is a lot of like scientific and organizations and civil rights organizations are now defining transgender as an umbrella term that is basically sort of synonymous with gender nonconformity. Colin has a really good piece about it in Reality's Last Stand about the transgender umbrella casts its shadow over gender nonconformity, where you can see like how they define transgender now. It's, it's basically synonymous with gender nonconformity.
Yeah, and I think, we're all academic. I mean, I think that's a big change, because, I mean, when I talked to Buck Angel on Cut the Bull, I mean, one of the things that Buck said that was really interesting is that most people would now say you don't have to have gender dysphoria to be transgender.
Yeah.
And
that's very common now.
Right.
Yeah, and that seemed openly insane, because being transgender is, it's a DSM-5 mental category. That's Buck.
Well, they have to use that. But there's so many changes going on right now, and they're trying, like the ICD-10 recently tried to reclassify it as like a sexual disorder. They want to get it out of, the DSM altogether, but they can't, because they need it to access the medical interventions. Yes. So, but they're constantly trying to destigmatize, gender dysphoria by saying that you can be trans without having gender dysphoria, and then it's just some sort of biological condition you can be born into, and it's just totally not true at all. There are biological conditions associated with being trans, like gender nonconformity and like same-sex attraction, but it isn't itself like a biological condition. There's like a
If it
ton of
were a biological condition, what would the test for that
there
be?
should be an objective test for it, right? So there's a whole bunch of studies on like on the transgender brain, and they basically show that these studies didn't control for confounding variables like same-sex attraction, and they claim to show that like trans people had brains of the opposite sex or something like that. And this myth is so pervasive. It's like even in the I Am Jazz children's book, where Jazz explains like, I have a female brain and a male body. It's just not true at all. It's been totally debunked by studies that did control for confounding variables, but the myth pervades.
And again,
that.
like, I'm not going to like do some kind of hardcore male feminist routine because I mean, there are a bunch of jokes there, like, because I'm not a creep. But I mean, it's remarkable how much of this is just straight up sexism. Like, there are two overlapping curves, but I'm not sure there are distinctive female brains that you can recognize when someone's 3 or something like that.
There's only group differences too. It's never at the individual level, so you would never be able to create a test, to scan your brain to say like you're trans. Like that it's not gender dysphoria. There's a high rate of desistance, and we have a new study right now even showing that German youth, about like 72% of 15 to 19-year-olds desisted from their gender identity diagnosis over a 5-year period, which is very significant.
That, by the way, I think is one of the most fascinating studies of this that I've seen. Like, I once saw a very briefly done, like, pre-IRB college study, this was like 6 years ago, that found exactly the same thing, that the length of time that someone was trans was like 8 months. And there was just massive attacks on this. People said, I mean, this is just a short preprint. I haven't cited it that much, but I assume that if someone did a large scale study, they would find exactly the same thing. And what Christina is referring to, there's this German study that looked at the thousands, right, of people. And they found that the average time they identified as transgender was maybe 5 years. That was like the median or something, but like 73% of them after 5 years were no longer trans. They were just normal.
Yeah, this study came out pretty recently, and it was looking at insurance data, and it was like a long-term study over anybody who had a gender identity related diagnosis. And they saw that over a 5-year period, most young people desisted, but across all age groups, it was over 50% desistance, highest
there you two go again. There you go again. To borrow a line from Reagan criticizing Mondale, you're citing evidence. Why would you let evidence disrupt a good ideology?
It's a rude thing to do against someone's religion. I'd agree. I mean, just as read 2 of these comments on the side. Trader Bear says, "Where are you guys getting that definition of gender?" I would actually pull this up, because it is the standard definition of gender. I mean, I'm looking at the usual Wikipedia and Britannica for just word sources here. Gender includes and is defined by the social, psychological, normative, and behavioral aspects of being a man or a woman. So, I mean, like, there isn't really some deep scientific idea here, other than they'll really phrase this to make it not sound sexist, but your gender is just what's
stereotypes.
So it's just stereotypical. It's like what's perceived as being female. And if you ever talk to these people that are transing their kids, which is a crazy experience, by the way, like I've been brought in a few times as sort of person that might be able to help with this, and there a lot of people have been, but it's just like, how did you know that your boy was a girl? Well, he liked pink and he got along really well with women, and he didn't like football that much. And it's kind of like, well, I like pink and get along pretty well with women. I'm not a girl.
But it's doctors who are telling the parents, and I mean, there's so many. There's over like 100 pediatric gender clinics now that have sprung up in the last 15 years across the United States. It's legitimized by the medical community, the concept of the transgender child. Doctors are telling parents, like, yes, this exists. Your child is transgender. We'll get them into a social transition, and when they're old enough, like 8 or 9 or 10 years old, we get them started on puberty blockers right away so they don't go through the wrong puberty. And they're, they're telling them that their kid is going to commit suicide if they don't transition. And they're telling them that their child is born that way. I mean, when we were just talking about the brain studies that have been debunked, a lot of that has been baked into legislation and medical guidelines already. Colin is dealing with a court case right now, and I just realized I don't know if I'm supposed to talk about it.
Yeah, don't talk about it then. Don't talk about
Maybe
but it is like the brain sex stuff keeps coming up in all these court cases. All these expert witnesses from the opposite side will testify saying like, yeah, innate gender identity, neurological sex, brain sex should override sex, and that trans people are born that with an innate gender identity that sort of resembles the opposite sex, something like that. Anyway.
No, yeah, it's a lot of this stuff. One of the things that I would add here, so like I'm deeply skeptical of the kind of the entire mental health establishment on this.
Yeah.
I'm like, when I grew up, I grew up in a functional class neighborhood, and one of the things that people would always say if they were dating middle class women or men that were taking all these psych drugs, which were becoming popular at the time, is like, stop doing that. It's messing you up. You're getting worse. And very often people would stop and they would just improve. They had already taken the drugs for the 6 months that you're ideally supposed to or whatever, and then they would just return to normal life and sort of stop being depressed. And, I wouldn't recommend, like letting your hood friends change your medication regimen necessarily for the audience, but like the sample size was several hundred, and most people did not seem to necessarily need to be treated for the rest of their life as crazy. And going forward as an adult, I saw a lot of actual data that seemed to support this. Like, for example, this popped up on social media. I looked up the source study, but the number of people out of 1,000 males and females over 18 that are taking serious psych meds across the major nations ranges from like 13 in Korea to I think it was 214 in the United States. Most of them are used about 10 times as often in America as in France, Lithuania, major countries. So I don't think that there's nothing to psychiatry at all, obviously, but I don't think that conditions like ADD are 10 times as prevalent at the level where they actually approach insanity in America as they are. Yeah, that's a terrible comment. That's one of the saddest cartoons of all time, where Calvin starts taking whatever it is, Ritalin, and he stops seeing Hobbs the tiger.
Oh.
That's really actually very descriptive of what happens to a lot of young boys. Like the rate at which people describe having imaginary friends, the rate at which people describe real free-form play with their boys, where they invent sports that haven't been seen before, like all of that is down something like 90%, because we're giving little kids these drugs. Like if your little boy comes in and says there's an elephant in my room, the typical dad would now no longer make a fake gun and go hunt the elephant with his son. He would go put him on a bunch of pills because he would pretend that he was crazy. So at any rate, some of these conditions exist at some level. We're vastly overprescribing them to make.
Yeah, I was on a lot of psychotropic medication when I was young. A lot of it.
Interestingly enough, I wasn't on any. And later in life, when I worked for a company we'll call M. Evans in Chicago, we had a psychiatric care as one of the perks if you're an executive. And I went and talked to a guy, and we were both fairly friendly. We worked for the company. But I asked what he could diagnose me with. And he was like, oh, I mean, you have ADD and OCD, and you're probably a sociopath, and like you could be more sober and all this other stuff. This is a very real conversation. Like, what would the technical diagnoses for a typical business executive potentially be? And I think that very many people who are essentially normal people, like I make fun of myself to a significant degree, but I think I'm quite a normal, fairly successful individual. A whole bunch of people wander into this world and they're told, well, you were in one abusive relationship. You have trauma, perhaps PTSD. You have trouble sitting still as an intelligent male under 25. You have ADD. The solution for that is for you to take pure amphetamine for the rest of your life. And once you begin, read the side of an Adderall bottle. The only ingredients are amphetamine and salt, man. I mean, so it's like once you start that, I'm rambling a bit, but once you start that, it's very hard to get out of that cycle. And that's why you see 20 times the level of psych med use in the USA as versus Korea or the Eastern European states. We're not 20 times as crazy as the East Asians. I mean, it's a culture dependent, state dependent syndrome.
Well, we had this great umbrella review that came out a couple of years ago that totally debunked the chemical imbalance theory of depression. The idea that, I mean, this review was incredible. It was led by Joanna Moncrief. And there's just, it personally affected me because when I was a teenager, I was told by a psychiatrist that I had a chemical imbalance in my brain, and that's why I needed to take antidepressants to correct the imbalance. And I told her that to be, it's not true at all. There's no merit to it. Like, antidepressants have this sort of like emotional blunting effect that maybe can be useful in short term, but I got off of all of the drugs that I was on. I was put on a lot of drugs when I was a teenager, and I'm still mad about it.
Hey, I'm curious. Go ahead.
No,
go
just
ahead,
very briefly,
Will.
like one point that I was gonna make there before launching into that soliloquy about anti-description or antidepressant prescription rates in Korea. But one point there is that I mean, it's solid data. But like one point there is that with a lot of this stuff, there's not really a testable Popperian kind of mechanism that's used to determine whether you have these conditions or not. And a lot of times this really bothers me because there could be. So like people keep saying, well, brain scans indicate that if you actually have ADD, there's this pattern of activity going on, and for $410 you can determine that. Yeah, okay. But that's not actually how you determine whether young men should be placed on Adderall, actually. There's the last time, a friend of mine described what happened with his son. There's usually a 7-item checklist that you fill out. I mean, at least this is what we do in Kentucky and Illinois.
It's diagnosed behaviorally. Same thing with autism too. It's all like there's no objective test for it. I've developed a lot of psychiatry critical views too, because a lot of them are, you could see yourself in a lot of different kinds of diagnoses. Like when I was a teenager, I used to try on different diagnoses to see what fit, because I knew there was something off about me. But
but I mean, like, actually knowing you as a person and having gone to major events and watching you speak, it might be that there's not. Like, a lot of people just have, so like, I mean, I view myself as kind of nerdy, I guess is how I would describe it. Overly aggressive. I was dropped off in the hood by my mom, who was an inner city teacher, and I had to compete at an early age. But it did not occur to me, I guess, in my foundational years to describe being very aggressive, if pushed to it, as sociopathic. I'm in fact very peaceful and left alone. It would not have occurred to me to describe being a bit awkward in classroom on first dates as, what is it, social anxiety disorder?
Yeah.
Because the framework wasn't a prescriptive framework. It was just like one of my buddies would come up and say, hey, Reilly, go talk to her. Like there were normative solutions that existed in society within the context of an older framework that were actually quite effective. And I think that's what I learned probably the last generation, when even in the upper working class, you could learn that. And I'm very thankful for that and kind of want to pass that on. But the point though is when you said it's behaviorally typed, like that's absolutely correct. Like for ADD, it's literally a checklist of like, does he run around? And I mean, remember, these are 11-year-old boys, like 10-year-old girls. So like 90% of the kids are going to be at least in the pool where you could give them the drug. I saw this recently myself with like, what is it, TRT, testosterone replacement therapy. So like I'm on social media and I'm a former athlete who's at 40. So I'm starting to get all these ads from like Rex Lion Clinic, like make yourself a man again. And I actually, like, I'm pretty comfortable where my like levels of stuff are, so I'm not really getting into it. But I looked at the survey once and it was like, do you wish you could have more sex? Like, were you once
No.
higher than you can today? Like, were you a better athlete on the high school varsity than you are now? And it was like, come on now, player. Like, I get what you guys are doing, but you're all doctors. Like, have a little dignity. Right. And it's the same way when you're pitching stuff at kids or at troubled teenage girls. And just be aware of that, parents and everyone else.
Yeah.
So you answered no to do you want to have more sex?
Well, no, I mean, I'm interested.
That was a joke. That was a joke.
No, I'm not going to tell you in detail. Like, well, but like one thing that I will say, actually, I looked up some information on this just out of curiosity. And one of the things I found was that there are a whole bunch of women that are actually pretty critical of testosterone therapy. So like there were all these wives that were like, in a typical happy marriage, we have sex like 2 or 3 times a week. I like it. But my husband took all these drugs because he felt unmanly, and now he's constantly harassing me. He's like eating only raw meat, and it's actually a real pain in the ass. I'm like a 50-year-old lawyer. What's going on?
Yeah,
with
that's
all
pretty
this?
crazy.
And it
Yeah, that
costs
whole
like
thing is pretty
$800
crazy.
a month. Like, stop it. So I did view the actual take of like happily married women as interesting. So there's like the male impression of what this would be, and then there's the actual reaction of like, I have to go to the hospital. I'm a registered nurse. Like, this is irritating.
So I have a kind of a related question. Did you hear about the when LA City just took down a couple of no U-turn traffic signs in Silver Lake, California, because they're anti-LGBTQ?
Yes, and I'm curious about why that. I mean, you could make a joke about
What?
like no exit or bareback road or something, but I mean, like, why no
Oh,
U-turns?
that was good. I didn't even think of that. I kept trying to think of I kept trying to come up with how that's bigoted. I can't seem to but if you hadn't heard of it, that's fine. I was
Did
just
they
trying to make sense of
explain?
it.
Did they explain why? How the U-turn symbol was
I mean,
anti-LGBT?
that's the only thing I can say is there you go again. Reed, we should play that clip with Reagan said there you go again. I don't know. It's the whole thing is just it's just one mountain of crazy. So I'm still trying to make intelligible why. The other thing is I think that largely emboldens people on the right to say, look at these people, they're completely insane. Therefore, you need to vote accordingly. And the pushback from the left that they don't want any kind of reform, any kind of meaningful conversation about what their flaws could be, only further emboldens the right and makes them look like they're completely demented.
By the way, actually, I pulled this up on one of my side devices. The reason for this is that there was a lot of cruising in this neighborhood, which is like an upscale neighborhood, had a lot of gay people in it.
Yeah, and they said that they couldn't find their sexual partners because
there was a big gay scene, and also apparently there were a couple of straight clubs, and so you had people that were like cruising around, like stopping near the curb, like, "Hey, get in!" And so they said there were no U-turns, no slow driving, and so on. And now that's being taken down. And I'm not sure what the upside of that is going to be, since some of that still exists in the neighborhood. But now they're not going to be anti-gay.
Yeah, I guess the thing that, God, I would just love to be thinking about other things. The sheer amount of time thinking about this idiocy has cost me in terms of what I could be thinking about and how we could be advancing the human condition. But I guess there are just some people who they just have to go to crazy town, and then everybody else has to respond to these people going to crazy town.
That's everywhere. I sometimes, I get interested in other issues and I start looking into them further and why they're going wrong. And then I look at like the policy work and what people are actually like putting on paper and trying to pass off as factual. And I'm just it's very discouraging.
Which reminds me, so Will, what do you think? Like, if you were to say the top 5 problems in this country right now, what would you say they are?
I mean, well, to me, it's a mix of serious political science and the woke and alt-right going at it. I mean, the number one problem is the national debt. I mean, just
completely agree.
The country's $34 trillion in debt. Like, if we and the Chinese were to call in all the chits that we hold to one another, I mean, like the global economy is pegged to the U.S. dollar, but we owe them 11 of 34 trillion. I mean, there'd be either a global collapse or a world war between the two powers.
I think it's 54 trillion.
Is it true that Democrats kind of like create a bunch of moral panics and then create a bunch of like sort of biased research to support their moral panic and then just try to create legislation to...
Everybody does that.
Everybody does that?
I think both sides do this. I mean, so like one of the things that has really irritated me on Twitter for a while is like the black guy versus white guy, like beating up guy series of videos.
That's right. I see that everywhere.
Yeah, and like there are more black guys beating up white guys and white guys beating up black guys. But the one time I did a deep dive on this for my book Taboo, like violent interracial crime was 3% of crime. The person most likely to kill you was your wife. But I mean, like overall, interestingly enough, like there was more overall male on female domestic violence and vice versa. And that was the biggest chunk of serious crime. But it was just like there were all of these actual crimes. And the crime that got the most attention from both races was 3% of violence. Now, it was also 75+% black on white. woke stuff was especially obnoxious. But I think that anytime people use fringe incidents like this to say, well, there's an epidemic, we need to change society, radically reshape the laws, whatever, that allegation could be made. Like Barry Glassner back in 1990, a man of the left, but a really good social scientist, wrote A Culture of Fear and actually said that almost every major panic. Now, a lot of the stuff he wrote since then was kind of panic from the left, entertainingly. But like he said that almost every major panic, like pit bull attacks, planes falling out of the sky, crack babies, cop killer bullets, almost all of them were based around like a tiny number of cases on right and left. And the example he used in the book that sticks with me today is young child kidnapping. Where, I mean, in the late 90s, early 00s, like I remember upper middle class women in my friend's dating pool were literally walking around with their kids, who at this time are like 2 years old, on leashes. Like there's panic, like baby Amber idea of like, they're coming. You can't let your kid play in the park. They'll steal them. Rapists are everywhere. And he actually went through all of the state level jurisdictions and looked at the total number of kids that were kidnapped, like taken by a non-family member, more than a week, physical or sexual abuse, like a reasonable definition. And it was, I think the year he looked was 192. And he just made the point, like, imagine how difficult it would be as an adult male to walk into a park with a bunch of parents sitting around, like take a screaming kid and with no one stopping you, walk out with it. Like, how often could this occur? And it occurs about as often as you would suspect, and about as often as unarmed men, all races here, are shot by the police on an annual basis and so on. So yeah, I think that's a weakness of politics in general. Like people will point to something, it's a bleeding old Asian lady and say, that's not a terrible thing, but say like, look at this, a national movement's needed now. And what I would encourage people to do in that situation, although I gave $20 to stop Asian hate, but is look at how many cases of that particular thing there actually are on a weekly or monthly basis. Where are they occurring? Like it turned out that to the extent there was a problem with Asian hate at all, the perps were mostly black, for example, which is one reason the movement collapsed. Like the targeting of white Trump supporters, there was none of that. Like who's doing it? How much of a problem is it? That all of that should be done anytime there's a panic.
Yeah. And over what time period? And yeah, try to come up with some actual data. There's something that I'm going to need to like ask you about to help me with another issue that I'm covering right now. But it's the same thing happening where a few incidents of, something horrible happening gets kind of blown out of proportion and like, oh, we need to like completely stop using this one type of intervention because this sometimes happens.
I just want to do a few things, and I want to talk about your book. I just want to real quick. So you and I agree with. I would argue to you not to push back, but to just situate this, that we are in the minority of the minority of the minority of people who think that the number one problem in this country is the national debt. No one gives a shit. No one talks about it. I never hear anybody. I haven't heard Trump say anything about it. I haven't heard Biden. I haven't even heard RFK say anything about it. So I agree. That's the number one. What would you say, and not to necessarily put you on the spot, and Christina, you could jump in here. What would you say are some other top 5 problems
in the United States right now?
Oh.
Yeah, in the U.S. Yeah,
I deal with very niche areas, and I spend all my time focusing on them. So I would not be a good person to ask about what the normal person.
What do you think?
Overall problem is?
What do you think? So we both agree with the number one problem right now. What do you think just some other problems are?
Well, actually, I mean, I'm a right-wing writer. So, I mean, number 2, I'd say, is mass migration. Like, it's absolutely insane that the total number of people that have just illegally walked into the country during the Biden administration is pegged at 8 million right now. It's assumed that it's going to be 11 million by the end of this administration. That's absolutely insane. I mean, that's the population of Kentucky, by contrast, a good sized middle of the pack state, is about 6 million. So, I mean, I think that the idea that we have just mass population shift going on, I don't think racial demographics inherently matter. In fact, as a black guy, I mean, to me, a lot of these people are people from Caucasian failed states. When you look at Latin America and Eastern Europe, honestly, it's kind of funny. But that's something that we have to assimilate the population that's immigrated since 1966. I'd probably seal the border for a while, if we're being dead honest. I think wokeness would probably be a top 5 issue. And by wokeness, I mean the idea that all of society that appears morally neutral is actually set up to oppress. So, I mean, that's the core poison frog and like the Ibram Kendi, Richard
activism. Activism invading all of our like major institutions and research and things like that.
Yeah, but it's a crazy and specific kind of activism. So like it's all Marxism light to me. Like if you put aside the dog bleep economic theory, Marxian on how many widgets can be made by a man with good widget making skill and all that 1862 stuff. Marx's core insight is something he ripped off from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which is this idea that society is a trick. Like Rousseau's whole thing was that property law and the social contract were made up to ensnare people by those who already had property. It's kind of his response to the Locke and Hobbes school of thought. And Marx built on this a little bit. So his idea is that facially neutral systems, like the idea that anyone can acquire a business or property, are in fact designed to oppress and are maintained for the benefit of the people who are in power, who he called the bourgeoisie or the elite, versus the lumpen proletariat or the proletariat. Every other critical theory is just a lower IQ version of this. And this is one of my like little dinner party speeches, so you guys may both have heard some of it at events and so on. But, you know, critical race theory is just Marxism with the rich man replaced by the white man. So like standardized testing and so on is set up to benefit the white man. The tests are never intended to be fair. Math is a white thing, which would have surprised El Deber, the Muslim, the man responsible for it. But whatever, it doesn't have to make sense. It's religion. You know, fourth wave feminism, you replace the rich man with the man. So society is set up to benefit males. You know, marriage is a system designed to give men advantage to access to as much sex as possible. Catherine McKinnon. Now, again, does that really make sense? Is that true for the average married man as versus Tinder if you have even reasonable game? It doesn't matter whether it's true. It's a religious statement. But queer theory, you know, I'm really going on with this, but society is set up to benefit normal-looking sexual majority people and so on down the line. Wokeness is the application of all of this to our institutions. So society is set up to oppress. Any disparity in performance, to quote the great Tom Sowell, is evidence of this oppression. And so the solution, I guess, if we're going back to Kendi and Delgado, is equity, which is proportional representation regardless of performance. And actually applying this to all of our institutions, I think, is one of the biggest threats in society. I think it's fair to say that. When you look at causes of death in America, number 4 every year is medical error. 212,000 people are killed because doctors literally amputate the wrong foot, this type of crap. How much is that going to increase? That's real. There are 12,000 or so wrong foot cases.
What?
Not joking. Seriously, they put tags on the body. What you're supposed to do. Several of my friends are surgeons. If an incompetent nurse puts a tag on the wrong foot, you cut off the wrong foot. What happens if a doctor cuts off the wrong foot? You sue and you normally get about $600,000. Hospital will generally hush it up. You get shoes for the rest of your life too, usually.
Oh my God.
But so that's going to increase. Like, let me pull this item up. Blind pilots. Disabled pilots hiring program. Okay, so this is eTurbo News. It's a journal that caters to the airline industry, or at least it's a reprint of an article from one that is. I don't know how good eTurbo is. But so FAA seeks pilots and air traffic controllers with disabilities. This is Harry Johnson's article, January 16, 2024.
This isn't the Babylon Bee?
No, this is not the Babylon Bee. This is the eTurbo Aviation Journal. The agency responsible for civil aviation in the U.S. has a program called Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility. They're doing DEIA over there that focuses on recruiting, hiring, promoting, retaining, developing, and advancing individuals with disabilities, blah, blah, blah. According to the FAA official website, there is currently a strong focus on recruiting individuals with specific disabilities, such as hearing or vision impairments, missing limbs, paralysis, partial or complete, epilepsy, severe intellectual disability, psychiatric disability, and dwarfism.
You shouldn't be laughing.
You know,
that's awesome. I used to make fun of that, you know, about having a blind pilot or something, and then everyone, well, of course we don't have a blind pilot. I'm
really scared of flying already.
Oh,
I do it, but I'm always, it's terrifying.
Yeah, now, of course, these pilots would only be recruited in proportion to their percentage of the population. So, I mean, less than 1% of people are blind. So there's a 99% chance that your plane will land. Now, of course, I fly about 70 times a year.
Yeah.
You know, so it's like, this is actually not very funny at all.
No,
I personally,
not.
It's hilarious.
I have a kind of Norse view that a man lives as long as he lives and not a day longer. But
Yeah.
this is why I would view wokeness as potentially a top 10 problem. I mean, when I said I don't view moral rules as ultimate, that essentially means I don't view there as being a non-watchmaker personal God that judges human behavior in a world beyond this one. And I frankly don't think you guys do either. That means that morality is something that we human beings develop using logic and empathy. It's very important that you have a personal honor code that guides your life. But it's also very important that you not take non-ultimate rules to their ultimate logical conclusion. The ultimate logical conclusion of something that's clearly correct, like treat people fairly, is that you treat everyone absolutely fairly all the time. So if the blind are 2% of society, 2% of pilots must be blind. Now that's crazy. But if you've adopted a religious view of the non-religious concept of fairness, then 2% of people flying planes will be blind. And I've just shown you an article in a major aeronautics publication saying that 2% of people flying planes will be blind. I didn't make that up. So that's why I think that's a major problem. It's not just something we joke about on the right.
Oh my God. I didn't even know about that.
Now, Jay Sweats, I'm sorry to all interrupt here, but Jay Sweats says something that we've all been bosses, I think is very important. They're probably hiring these people to fulfill DEI requirements, and they'll never actually put them in charge of a plane. Now, last quick comment. This is one of the things with affirmative action, right? Like, to be a lawyer, you have to take the bar. I've taken the bar. What we normally see with law school minority admits, I can't speak for any other profession, is that if you bring in 35% minorities and you push them through law school, when they take the bar, 60% of them fail. So actually, Black lawyers and Hispanic lawyers, certainly Asian lawyers, on average, are about as good as white lawyers. The cutoff comes when you just fire 60% of the people you used to make your brochure look good. So will something like that happen? Now, that's brutal. It's awful. But will something like that happen with pilots? You hope it does.
I'm on Google Scholar almost every day looking for studies to report on related to gender medicine, and it's very discouraging because 95% of it is just bullshit. They've just totally accepted everything that activists have said as like fact, and just the amount of nonsense that gets passed off as like scholarly research it's so disturbing. It's having to sift through it every day. Just this is like the state of things right now. Activism in research.
Yeah, I think we're broadly on the same page as to what society's top problems are. Two questions. The first, and if I'm missing something, Will, let me know. I don't understand, why do those things make you a conservative? Why does spending going crazy, and why does vetting people who come through the border, like, what is conservative about that? Is it the Thomas Sowell notion you want to conserve the order? Like, why doesn't that, or the gender idea, the transitioning, like, aren't though, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but aren't those just evidence-based positions? What makes those conservative?
Well, I think terms have a context-dependent meaning. Like when I said I'm moderately feminist, I mean, that's not a crazy position either. It's just, it's liberal in the modern sense. I mean, so like, most people would be classical liberals in the United States in the intellectual class, in the sense that we believe you can say most things, you should be tolerant of most nonviolent perspectives, so on.
That's me. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's me also, actually. I mean, no, I'm a conservative in the sense that probably for the next 8 years, I'm going to vote for the Conservative Party if I lived in the US or the UK. I mean, that's what in practice that means.
Okay.
Yeah,
and you're saying that because you believe that the Conservative Party holds the same points that you hold, and you hold those because they're based on evidence and data. Well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is that right?
I think that there are views that the Republicans and the Democrats are both strong on, or at least have been historically. I think the Democrats are better on healthcare, for example. My old party joke is a Frenchman and, great nation of Mexico can manage something like a national healthcare system. I don't see why Americans can't. We currently have 9 different healthcare systems like iCobra and the VFA for veterans. As a competent boss, I would imagine I could combine those and shave about 10% off costs at the top, and then you can go to the doctor for free. Given that we pay taxes, we pay Medicare, Medicaid, FICA already. So there's a funding source available for that. Bernie Sanders calls this Medicaid for all or Medicare for all. His proposal's not crazy. But I mean, in general, in terms of a series of things like crime, fatherhood, and somewhat traditional relationships, absent, the old he slaps her and she stabs him type of abuse, but crime, fatherhood, education, things like phonics, immigration, guns, a number of other things, even stuff as basic as requiring IDs for voting. I think the positions of the mainstream Republican Party or the Bill Clinton era Democrats make a lot more sense than kind of the Joe Biden era positions that you're hearing from the left today. Yeah.
Which is basically just progressives who have kind of taken over.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, the whole politically homeless phenomenon comes from the fact that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party used to both be kind of relatively mainstream. It's kind of Wall Street versus Main Street. I mean, the old jokes, we've all heard them. Right now, something that everyone who's an academic or a business person is aware of, and the thing that causes the politically homeless phenomenon is the reason for this is that perspectives that used to be entirely fringe, like America was built on Black slavery, have come out of the studies departments in academia following Trayvon Martin, following Michael Brown, during this time of really intense upper middle class guilt to become mainstream. And the stuff is still nonsense. But like, even in the most fringe fields, you hear things like there were 15 million Native North Americans when whites arrived here to genocide them. And if you are not someone who follows the new religion, like you just read the books that were absolutely standard during, again, a more Popperian, you've got to prove that in your methods tables era, like 12 years ago, you know that a lot of this isn't true. Like if you read the best research in 2010 or you read the best Chinese or French research now, it's just BS. The Native North Americans figure is like 1.7 million. I just read Elizabeth Weiss's book where she demonstrates that for like 15 pages. But a lot of this fringe stuff has become absolutely mainstream on the left. It's become almost impossible to dodge on the left. And that's pushing a lot of people right. The question is how the right will handle that. And I think like most people, if they encounter us or even Donald Trump when he's coherent, will just say, okay, I'm going to vote for the Republicans for a while. The issue is that the Republican core is as crazy as the Democratic core. Yeah. So like if you get on, I don't think you can find it on Google, but if you get on DuckDuckGo or Yandex or a real search engine, if you will, and Google repeal the 19th Amendment, you'll find that old petition that has like 4 million signatures right now, where all these people are like, yeah, when we take power, these bitches won't be able to vote anymore. And it's kind of like, yeah, these guys are dead serious, aren't they? And you hear conservative political figures say stuff like this all the time. Like Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA a couple months ago said their focus this summer is going to be on criticizing Martin Luther King. Mm-hmm. MLK had his mistresses and so on. I think the jury's in on Martin Luther King being mostly a good dude.
Yeah.
So when people hear this sort of thing, I think there's often this sensation of I'm trapped between two groups of idiots. I really wish there were more parties in America. You get a lot of that kind of thing.
Let me ask you a question, something that I've been perseverating, or I've just been fascinated by this for a long time. Why do you think some people fell for it and some people did not? The massive nonsense.
Well, you mean during the Great Awakening?
Yeah, specifically.
Are we talking about 2020?
Yeah. Why do you think some people fell for this? All disparities are due to systems, and the men can become pregnant, and feminine men are really women. Like, why did some people fall for that and other people did not?
I'm not sure how many people actually fell for it. I mean, so this is
I did.
Really?
Yeah. In 2020 for like 8 months, I was a social justice warrior, and I worked on a progressive Instagram page with like 750,000 followers, just churning out outrage porn. But I bought the systemic racism stuff for sure because it was in Washington Post and New York Times and MSNBC and CNN and all of these. Everybody was, I mean, it was almost like the illusory truth effect or like the bandwagon effect. It's like, not these many people can't be wrong. Like this has to be a real thing. Until I discovered more like heterodox sources who were kind of like talking about the data and talking about why disparities doesn't necessarily mean racism, and realizing like, oh wait, no, that actually makes a lot more sense. Why did I ever fall for this? And I kind of like compartmentalized my critical thinking skills, I guess you could say. And there were other like incentives too. I gained I gained a lot of followers when I was a social justice warrior. And there was that part of it. And then I lost them all after I started posting things like, there's only two sexes and we shouldn't cancel each other and stuff like that. They all left.
There's only two sexes. It just, I mean, you can't cross that line. Like,
so why? So some people fell for it, and other people did not. And I'm trying to figure out. Yeah, here's Reed just posted the disparate outcomes do not imply disparate treatment.
Because people trust authorities. I trusted. I mean, I had no idea the problems within mainstream media until I started looking into issues more closely and realizing how wrong they are about so many things. And journalists today, a lot at these mainstream outlets, they don't act like journalists. They just sort of news aggregation. They just sort of like copy what other people are doing. And mass, like when so many people are saying the same thing over and over again, you assume, because you don't want to look into it too deeply yourself, that it's true. Like, because this many people can't be wrong. But that's how it goes. That's how it got me.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary overall. I mean, so I wrote down a couple things. I mean, so first of all, I think that one of the reasons so many people fell for this is that there were a lot of people that pushed this narrative as soon as it was possible to push it. And in the book, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, I mean, I talk about some of this. Like, there are actual networks designed to promote these ideas. And I mean, I'm sure we have, boom, look at that beauty. But I mean, I'm sure that the right does this too. I mean, the publication Breitbart is named after Andrew Breitbart, one of the great culture warriors, and it still has 1 million followers and so on. But like, this was the left's moment. Like, we didn't have, a guy die to start the period of rioting. So it was there was a network of people that were saying this is the storyline, that were going out there, at least as effective as quote unquote our guys. So there was an impetus to make this happen. Now, why did people believe it? Since it was mostly bullshit. I mean, Michael Brown was a felon who had previously robbed a beloved minority businessman who was trying to kill a cop when he was shot. Even George Floyd had taken a fatal dose of opiates, although that may or may not have been the thing that killed him. Obviously not ideal policing there. Why do people just blindly believe this? I think Christina said most of the major reasons. I mean, for one, you assume that everyone can't be lying to you. Like, most people don't know the baseline facts about structural bias in society as it actually exists. So, I mean, obviously there is some racism against blacks and all that, but it also is the case that the mainstream media leans 93% to the left and 7% to the right.
Okay, so
2004 replicated 2011, like we all know it. So if you don't know that, it seems like everyone's saying one thing. Can they all be lying? No, that's a crazy conspiracy theory.
All right, so let me ask you a question.
Right.
I'm going to push back on that a little bit. Do you think that the people who fell for this have a disposition in common? For example, do you think that the people who fell for this, which seems to me clearly insane, like anyone who sat down for 5 seconds would think about some of this stuff is realize it's complete bullshit. Do you think, and let me drill down on that, if I may, a little bit. Are the people who fell for this the kinds of people who are more likely to say, I'm on the right side of history, you're on the wrong side of history, and less likely to say, you know what, I was wrong, I'm sorry, I made a mistake? Would those be dispositional qualities of the people who fell for things that were just...
I was both. I was like very aggressive when I was, I guess progressive or a social justice warrior. And then I came out and I, said afterwards, like, I made a huge mistake. I was super wrong about some of this stuff. But it was also just, prior to that, like I was completely apolitical. I didn't deal with politics. I barely read the news, but it was this moment in 2020 where I was watching the news constantly because we were experiencing a COVID pandemic. So I was just, introduced to it that way. And it wasn't just like, it wasn't a whole bunch of issues. So it wasn't like I wasn't a trans rights activist. It was just, I totally accepted that systemic racism was real and that we needed, or also that police shootings were a lot more common than I thought. I mean, that also has to do with sort of like an algorithm bias where we're just constantly seeing on our feeds, videos of police confrontations, and then we sort of assume that this is the norm. And you have all these, race baiting activists who are just constantly saying like, this is white supremacy. This is happening regularly.
Even that, let me just pause you even on that. And Wilfred, you've written, oh, by the way, I just meant to say this to you. I just yesterday, Reed and I was interviewed for a documentary by these Brazilian guys. They interviewed you. They said you did a great interview, and they had 2 of your books on the table in the background.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, no, they came down here. I had a good interview with them. That was the day the book dropped, so it was some kind of awkward scheduling. Like,
yeah, they're great guys.
They were great guys. Yeah.
Okay, so back to this idea. So I lost my train of thought thinking about those guys interviewing.
I think what you were asking, if you don't mind me kind of jumping back, is just like, is there something psychologically that all these people had in common? I'm actually going to push back on that a little bit. I don't really think so. Now, I think there's some correlations there. Let me look at the side here. So Confluent says the people who fall for this tend to be driven by or are driven by compassion, groupthink, agreeableness, and a penchant for trusting educational authorities. Yeah. I think that's being a little more polite. I think another way to say that would be that they tend to be young and female. Like, no, I mean, you definitely saw like 2 patterns in who turned woke. Young tended to be female, tended to be voters for the Liberal Party. I mean, I think those are patterns you see. But I mean, I also think you saw like 45% of males initially thought Michael Brown was murdered. I mean, maybe more than that. It was probably 60% the first couple of weeks. So I think, no, there were a lot of people, like, no excuses. There were a lot of people from every background that went along with this. Like, if you look at those mobs that are surrounding dining couples and like doing them Caesar fists and telling people, like, this is the most diverse crowd in the world. 70% of arrested BLM rioters were white.
No, I'm not talking racially. I'm talking about an attitudinal disposition that those people have.
About 40% of them were male. Some of them were former conservatives. I think there were correlations, but no, I don't think they all fit one pattern. I certainly don't think they were all on SSRIs or something. What I think is that in terms of what you guys have said so far, I think there were activists that intentionally moved when they had a chance to. Yeah. And I think that
they were ready. They were ready. All of that critical race theory stuff, they've been working on that for years, and that this moment just like and there was like guilt associated if you didn't share it. Like, you needed to share these posts on Instagram, all these like slideshows that teach you how to be anti-racist. Like, that's how that stuff spread.
Yeah, no, but I mean, I think that that's all actually correct. Like, yeah, the crits in academia and the different version in the hood and so on, this was their moment. People said this. I mean, like, the Black Lives Matter people had been like race hustling at the neighborhood level for years. Like, we were trained Marxists. But so, like, that's why they did it. Why did everyone else go along with this? Why did 60% of the country go along with this? No, they weren't all crazy. They were only slightly disproportionately female and all that. The reason, I think, is, 1, that argument, everything I hear can't just be wrong. But 2, a more enhanced version of that Stoll explained in his latest book. For most people, this was the only explanation that you see. And I think this is worth discussing for a second. Like, when you look at Black communities, this would be equally true of poor white communities, by the way, but no one cares about poor whites in the USA, and no one looks at them. So, like, whenever I mention, like, in Appalachia, except for murder, there's the same crime rate that there is in the hood, and people are even poorer, and like, you got all these single moms. Like, I coach a working class white basketball team sometimes, so everyone's like, I don't care. Whatever. Trailer park down there, people are just abandoned. Who cares? They're just like Black people. It's kind of like, it's a weird reaction because neither Black activists who no longer get their racial privilege if you acknowledge poor whites and natives, or alt-right types who have suddenly had like the racial supremacy thesis disproven, want to discuss this huge chunk of the country. Like, the 50% of people on welfare are just regular white guys. It's odd to me. But I mean, anyway, moving back to the point, like, if you look specifically at Black communities, which is the poverty you see in most urban areas, frankly, it's awkward to explain why this is. Like you've got one group of people that make $85,000 a year and work in tech, and you've got another group of people that make $26,000 a year and, you know, work in ordinary blue collar jobs, which are moving out to the suburbs. And if you go to the university, it's often presented to you that there are two possible explanations for this. One is racism of some subtle kind. We're depriving the second group of people in the schools. And the other is genetic inferiority. Do you think there's something wrong with them? This is what Ibram Kendi keeps asking in his books. Do you think black people are stupid? They're dumb? They're monkeys? And the reality is there's a complex picture here, which might include some genetics at the margins. I don't even think so. Which includes cultural questions like the black guys in the South who performed about the same as the white guys in the Deep South migrated to the North, whereas the poor whites didn't have to because racism in the South didn't discriminate against whites. So slums in the North became heavily black. Whites in surrounding slums during busing fled to poor exurbs, blah, blah, blah. So there actually is an explanation, but most people don't know it. And it's become very taboo to talk about it because it implies that a black culture that was picked up from equally broke rednecks 100 years ago kind of sucks and should change. Now that's true, but you're not supposed to say it. So you have this whole thing where like the two explanations become like genes or racism. Yes, I do mention this in another book, Taboo. But so you have these two explanations, genes or racism. They're just astonishingly simplistic. But if you don't want to be a genetic racist, you're supposed to say racism. So I think that's why everyone said racism for 10 years. And if you say, well, the cause of every gap is racism, that is a testable epistemological scientific theory, right? Like it produces predictions. So the only reason black people are getting arrested more is that there are more cops in black neighborhoods. That provides an explanation. We should take cops out of black neighborhoods. So we tried that. We reduced police stops by, I believe it's my colleague Bob Moranto that calculated this 61% in many black areas. So what happened? Well, the murder rate doubled. Because it turns out that just as you would have seen in poor white or Hispanic immigrant areas, the actual problem was crime. So, I mean, like we just did all this for 10 years and nothing worked. And now I think people are saying, okay, hopefully people won't swing back to the explanation as genetics, although even that would at least result in more cops. But I mean, hopefully we're swinging back to a period where people will say, well, there are multivariate explanations for things. Yeah. If black or Italian or Hispanic immigrant or anything else neighborhoods have a lot of crime, we can look at why that is and send in real social scientists, but first we need to arrest criminals, and that will actually improve those areas.
Yeah, but people tend to like the simple explanations better.
Yeah.
Definitely helps activists get more followers.
I want to talk quickly about your most recent book. We can see it in the background. Would you mind holding that up for us, please?
Yeah, I've got it right here. This is one of the author copies, but it's
there you go. And who published that? Who publishes that?
HarperCollins. So this
Lies
is my book.
Liberal teacher told me. Could you tell us about one or two of those lies? The Native American thing is always good, but and anything.
Yeah, well, so the book Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, and I actually like the title. I'm fine with all my titles like Hate Crime Hoax, How a Race War is Being Sold. But I mean, I will say book titles are designed to be provocative, move some units. But the book itself is a response to a whole genre of books that have come out over the past really, what would you say, 40, 50 years? I mean, so there's Lowen's Lies My Teacher Told Me.
Right. Howard Zinn's book, too, the People's...
Howard Zinn's old book? Communist Howard Zinn. Yeah, his is A People's History of the United States. Mm-hmm. There's the 1619 Project's book, 1619, A Black History of the United States.
It's a Hulu series too, I think.
I'm sorry?
I think there's a Hulu series about it too.
Yeah, there is. I mean, there really are like 10. There's also Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, A Native History of the United States. That book in particular, that's probably the best written of the ones I've described, but is almost funny because it's just a recitation of the native defeats during 400 years of war, with the author not mentioning any of the victories. So you kind of wonder why the war took 400 years. Like the whites may just have been very slow walkers or something like that. But it's just the endless litany of pain and tragedy. But all of these books have two things in common. Like one is the idea that Western culture is the worst culture in human history. Mm-hmm. I mean, so a typical high school or college textbook will mention that Westerners, white descent culture, Euro descent culture, American and Five Eyes culture, however you want to put it, was responsible for slavery, was responsible for conquest, was responsible for poor treatment of battle captives, oppression of women, dropping big bombs on our enemies. And you get the impression, because there is almost no discussion of this happening elsewhere, that nobody else engaged in these barbarous practices. That's part one. And part two, certainly with Zen, very much with any of the feminist stuff, like Ansel Dua's Bridge Is My Back, any of that. But like, is the impression that you are part of a witty anointed elect if you know that these things happen. So textbooks all have these like snarky little corner panels, like your parents probably don't know much about feminism, but, you know, or, you know, not everyone's aware of what we're about to tell you.
Yeah.
You know, Howard Zinn, I'm about to teach history from a forgotten perspective, you know, that of the neglected. And in my book, I'm responding to both of these claims. So first of all, Western culture was not the worst human historical culture. It was probably the best. All human societies have been responsible for exactly the same things throughout history. And there's an important point here, which is that when we talk about morals not being ultimate, kind of Western purple-haired dorm room morality didn't exist anywhere until about 40 years ago. I mean, a good cutoff year for the development of the world, for good or ill, depending on how you think about it, I'd say mostly for good, is 1954, when the USA desegregated, the final Geneva Convention was signed. I believe it was either 54 or 46 that we formally repudiated the right of conquest, so on down the line. Before that, if you won a war with someone, it was considered a reasonably honest war on both sides. You took over their country. That was now your country. This was accepted by everyone. The major quote unquote POC states like China, Ethiopia, Japan were as fully on board with this as any white country. So Western culture was not responsible for anything that other cultures did not do at roughly the same scale. I mean, I spent a few pages discussing the almost impressive conquests of Genghis Khan, the Mongol emperor, who took over a huge chunk of the world, built whole cities out of human skulls, and so on. The major thing distinguishing the West from other previous societies actually, in fact, was a decision to repudiate this kind of behavior. So I talk about emancipation, the idea held by people who were not themselves slaves that slavery was bad, and how the USA and the UK sort of gloriously spread that around the world in this almost forgotten history. That's part one. And I think the discussion of that is interesting. I think it's lively. Chapter 1 is just slavery was a human universal. The idea that true slavery was unique to the USA, it's complete BS. But I think the second point is actually more interesting, in that the idea that knowing about feminism or knowing about Marxism makes you somehow unique and educated is sort of nonsensical propaganda. These ideas have been the mainstream thing Western education has been teaching for 40 years. So I open each chapter by citing and quoting the major textbooks we use in high school and college and explaining, like, this is the norm. You know, I'm a popular writer, but I'm on the right. And this one small book is actually rebelling against the norm. And then I ask a question like, why are we in this position where the people who have most of the power, in an era where pride parades and kink parades are sponsored by Halliburton, why are they constantly talking about being oppressed? Where did that come from? How do we rebel against it? So a lot of the other topics in the book, like, were hippies the good guys? Was the sexual revolution good for women? Was the Vietnam War pointless and unpopular? All those are concentrated in chapters 4 and 5. Talk about this sort of dynamic. And I mean, the reaction that I've gotten to it so far is pretty good. There are 10 lies total.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm gonna buy a copy off of Amazon, but we didn't get a pre-copy. And people can find the book where, Will?
Well, you can find the book pretty much wherever. What's the old line where fine books are sold? I mean, so most of my books, that's the lies my liberal teacher told me page. Most of my books, without false modesty, have done pretty well. Like, I have this up on Amazon right now.
Yeah, but there was one negative review from someone who called you like, this is right-wing propaganda.
Yeah, we've got the one negative reviewer. Now this guy seems to have a real
add
problem
some new
with
reviews. Everybody write some reviews.
Yeah, well, thanks. I probably wouldn't have said it myself, but I appreciate it that you did. But so this guy, I'm pretty sure, has written 3 reviews. So like the boy Darrow here, I got a 1-star review from someone who clearly didn't read the book. It was just someone with an Amazon review account who signed it.
That happens, yeah.
So then Amazon flags this, takes down the 1-star review, and puts up this thing that says, we have 0 tolerance for fake reviews for political books, which I appreciate. Thanks, Amazon. So now then the guy comes and early yesterday puts up another 1-star review with his name that says this is right-wing propaganda with no description. So Amazon takes that down. Now then the same guy comes and puts up a lengthy review that says this is just right-wing propaganda. I'm still not sure whether this guy's read the book, whether I owe this guy money or something. But so there's one negative review, and then there are a number of 4- and 5-star typical reviews. But apparently 500 plus people have bought or read this book in the past couple of weeks.
And he didn't, it's not a verified purchase, by the way.
Yeah, it's generally when you write a book on the right, or I'm sure the left, there are going to be a certain number of people that will just sign in and say, no, this guy's on the other baseball team. Like, I'm not going to support this. Boo. And, I think that's pretty corny, but I guess everyone needs a hobby.
Well,
So.
you might have to write a sequel, because there's a lot of stuff going on right now in high school textbooks with regards to gender stuff, gender nonsense. With how many, gender identities there are, and so we might need a sequel.
All right, go ahead.
I'm actually surprised that I've never written anything. Well, I mean, with you guys, we've talked about, I've written essays, short journal art pieces, or magazine pieces at least. But I'm surprised I've never written anything book length about gender. It's actually something that's never really been pitched to me. Like, I get the feeling that publishers view it as a really sensitive topic. If I brought it up, they'd probably accept it. I kind of feel like they're looking for women, preferably either detransitioners or feminists, to write it. So, like, I know Joyce, Abigail Schreier, so on have been approached, but yeah, they're right. You're probably going to see the dam break pretty soon. Like, the one gender piece I'd be interested in is one we've also discussed, which is there's obviously like a huge detrans movement out there kind of waiting.
Right.
Like, when you look at like detrans listservs and so on, and eventually those people are going to start coming forward. And so whoever writes the first piece there, I think, is going to, that'll be pretty well known 20 years from now.
Right. That's why we're working together on a survey for detransitioners based on one that I already did.
Travis Brown is doing some great work, some great documentary work. He wrote The Woke Reformation, and he's doing some fantastic work. We'll be at GenSpect
Portugal.
Yeah. Are you going to that?
I'm speaking.
Oh, good.
Maybe.
Yeah,
I got invited to it.
You should go. It'll be fun.
Portugal. Yeah, I probably will, honestly. Haven't been to Portugal.
Okay, cool. Let's do this real quick. Some super chats, and then Will, you've been very, very gracious with your time, so we appreciate it. Trader Bear, who's a good friend of the show, for $9.99. Woke plays in the postmodern sandbox, so forget arguing with reason.
Yeah,
that plays on the old idea that you can't, to a certain extent, that you can't talk someone out of a belief that they haven't talked themselves into, or reason someone out of belief that you haven't reasoned them into. Reed, put that up again. It just vanished from my thing. I wanted to comment on that. I don't see it. Woke plays in the postmodern sandbox, so forget arguing with reason. I don't think that's, I think that's true, but I think deep down inside people want to know what's true. I just had Reed and I just came back from Denver, where we had a conversation with one of the founding faculty members, and Will, you'd be a phenomenal, you truly would be a wonderful addition to the founding faculty at University of Austin. But in Aristotle's metaphysics, all people want to know, people have a hunger to know what's true. And I do believe that dialogue, discourse, etc., can help people, if you look at an intervention, to intervene in their thoughts and cognitions. That's an extraordinarily effective, if not the most effective way to do it. All right. Drowning in the scenery, $2. The Smith-Mundt Act. Will, do you know anything about that? I know nothing about it.
Let's take a look.
Mushy Season is a new member. Hey, Mushy. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
I know nothing about it. What is it?
Yeah, the Smith-Mundt Act. Obviously, to some extent, I just Googled this, but I also have a listing.
Oh, yeah. It's not. It's the U.S. Information Educational Exchange Act of, yeah. Okay. Sorry. Didn't know it was called that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that prohibits domestic dissemination of materials produced by programs for foreign audiences, and it regulates broadcasting of programs for foreign audiences. I don't really have any strong thoughts on this, actually. My understanding is that there are limitations on the use of propaganda within the United States. I mean, that's mostly how I've seen Smith-Mundt used in con law. That's most of the cases that I'm familiar with that regulate use of the law. I mean, I think the whole question of how we interact with foreigners in the educational space and in the propaganda space is interesting. And I think it's interesting beyond Smith-Mundt, for example. Like, one of my questions with wokeness is who's funding this. I mean, like, if I were a foreign nation, I would be very interested in providing financial support to a lot of the movement on the left, also on the right, to be honest. Yeah, like any DEI stuff, any white nationalist stuff, any of that stuff.
I'll give them ideas.
Just listen to me right now. You have no idea how prescient your statement was going to be. Truly, I've been saying this for years, but I know something you don't know, and something huge is going to break very soon about that.
What?
So you just
you can't tell us?
No, absolutely not on a live stream. But you just wait to see what's going to happen. It's mind-blowing. Okay, real quick, and then we'll let everybody go.
Maverick, not where you're moving to another country.
No, it's about the foreign investment and the foreign funding of this stuff to divide Americans. I've been screaming about it. No one listens. You scream about the debt. No one listens. You scream about no evidence. No one listens. So fuck it. What are you going to do? I mean, I'm going down fighting, but people just aren't interested. That's why the key, well, that's another conversation entirely, but just wait, Wilfred. You would not believe how prescient that was. Okay. Maverick Christian, $5. Thanks for visiting Fair in Minnesota a while back. It was nice to meet you. I remember when we first met in Bozeman, and then Christina and I met, oddly enough, just very recently at a Manhattan Institute event. And I remember when that was a really good conference. Schellenberger was there. Rufo was there. It was like Melissa Chen was there. It was kind of Local Distance was there. It was a really interesting. James Lindsay was there. Event. It was like a kind of a pre-strategy meeting. Rihan,
I heard about that.
Was there. It was like kind of a fascinating time. But do you do a lot of these events where you go around and meet people? And
I'm usually willing. I put a realistic limit on it. Even funded speaking, I put some realistic limits on, because I mean, I have to write and I have to do things closer to home, but I'm within reason. I'm more than willing to. I'm a pretty social guy.
You don't really travel out of the US, do you? I don't really see you traveling that much. Like Reed and I travel everywhere all the time.
I actually don't especially like travel. Like, I get work done when I travel, and I mean, I enjoy driving myself and all that. I mean, obviously I have friends in Canada and Mexico, but I mean, I'm a continental traveler. Beyond that, if someone's like, you want to go to Japan, you know, I partied and traveled a lot as a younger guy. Like, I mean, I lived in Latin America for a while, and it just, if you're going to pay me like $20,000 to come to Tokyo, yeah, like, I'm openly mercenary about some things, but just in general, like, do you want to go to Nigeria? Not really. So it would depend on the circumstances. It would depend on the situation. Yeah, look at that picture. I actually have that picture in my
Rihan,
study.
Walter Kern, James Lindsay, Schellenberger, Melissa, Kim, Ashranomani, me, you, Eric, who's a great guy, massive arms, Local Distance.
Eric and Wokel both look like they just got out of the gym in that picture.
Yeah. I kept screwing with him. I kept squeezing his arms. I'm like, dude, that's incredible. All right, cool. So, Christina, you have any final thoughts before we and thanks to Mushy Season for becoming a new member. You have any final thoughts before we let Wilfred go?
No.
Wilfred, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I mean, I appreciate, I guess a couple. I appreciate the people I'm a talkative guy. I appreciate the people that are interested in buying the book. You know, I've got a couple of messages over on Twitter. Somehow someone has my cell phone number, so I got 2 texts. But all right, yeah, wow. That's lies. My liberal teacher told me, if you're interested, go out and purchase that. That's on Amazon, so on. The best way to find me, by the way, apparently I'm shadow banned on Twitter after teasing Elon Musk a couple times, which I think is very funny.
No, really?
Yeah, I was in kind of a friendly competition with IO, which is kind of like I'm a culturalist, he's a hereditarian on sort of like racial issues.
Yeah.
And we had like there were a couple people that were about the same in terms of number of followers, and we're kind of keeping track of follower counts. And I noticed a couple of months ago that my follower count just wasn't increasing. I posted about it a couple times, like I'm not going to bitch about this, but guess these guys are pulling ahead of me. And people started messaging me and were saying, well, again, this doesn't matter, but you should know that you're shadow banned. So I actually logged in
How
using,
do you know?
like, you guys have met Jane, my fiance's Twitter account, and you literally can't find me on Twitter. So if you Google Wilfred Reilly, there are actually a surprising number of people that are like former students of mine using my face and so on. It's like Wilfred Reilly 2. They're all basically positive. I mean, but my account itself is not visible at all. And the only thing that I can think of, I mean, I write for Queer Majority occasionally, so I sometimes post about sex and relationships, but like they're actual prostitutes live on Twitter. So, I mean, the only thing I can think of is me arguing in exchanges with Elon Musk a couple times. And I'm pretty sure that's what happened.
There are prostitutes live on Twitter?
Yeah, I mean, Elon Musk just, porn is now, you can put full XXX content on Twitter and it's not an automatic.
Get their numbers quick. We need to get their numbers for Reed quick.
I thought porn was already on Twitter.
Well, it was, but your account was downgraded. So most of the people posting porn, about 70%, were what people refer to as porn bots. But I mean, like a couple of actual sex workers, including Brandy Love and Ella, follow my account. And I'm like friendly enough with them. Like, I mean, they're just cool, normal citizens. And like in exchanges, some of them have talked about like now porn is just legitimate on Twitter. And if you look at their policies, that's correct.
How do you become friends with these people? Like, that's just so outside my sphere. Like, what do you do?
Just follow you. Well, I mean, Brandy Love, conservative writer. She went to one of like CPAC or something, and like there was a question about whether she should be allowed to give a speech. But I mean, so like, first of all, right now I think of myself as a chubby 40-year-old writer, but like I used to manage a nightclub in Chicago. Like I'm very pro-sex. Like, I was a raver at 20 for like 8 years. So I mean, in terms of like, how does that mean? A sex worker, like,
what do you mean pro-sex?
I like sex. It doesn't bother me that someone's a sex worker as long as they're not trafficked or abused.
There's a lot of conservative and rad femmes who are like anti-porn and anti-sex work. So I think
there are a lot of people
that not against that.
Yeah, there are a lot of people who, like, if you were to ask conservative men or feminist women, like, is going down on the other sex abusive, you'd get like 35% yes. Like, that's been documented over and over again. Like, one of the things that's really notable about the current generation, like Gen Alpha or whatever, is that they're the least sexual in a long time. And again, as turn 40, I'm not an extraordinary beauty at this point, although I feel like
wait a second.
Like, I'm not out chasing women. But like it's the attitudes towards sex today, just in one brief sentence, are dramatically different from what they were in the raver or feminist or hippie generations in the recent past. Like rates of sexual partners have dropped by about 2/3.
Okay, hold on a second. I have to go to an actual in-person conversation live that we're going to record. But what do you mean? Could you repeat that? Rewind that? Going down on someone is an act of violence?
Sure. Yeah. So there is an attitude on both the Christian right, where the idea is that men should never submit to women, and the feminist left, where the idea is that because of power dynamics or some similar bullshit, men are always in charge, that says that most normal sex is abusive. If the other sex controls it, you're being abused. And because women are moving left and men are moving right. Now, most normal people don't believe this. Like most people offline like making their partner happy, which is healthy. It's the main predictor. Sex, money, and actually liking each other are the main predictors of stable relationships, as any sane person could tell you. But like, these are common attitudes. Like when I say I'm sex positive, I mean, I think that if you consent to something that's not punching each other in the face and you're both cool with it, you should do that. I don't think that legal pornography, like the most popular male porn search is blowjob, is particularly disturbing. I don't think it's gotten more violent over the past 20 years since Napster and 4chan in 2002. I mean, a lot of this stuff is just nonsensical. But there's a major anti-sex, anti-porn, like anti dating, where guys will say like, I ain't spending $200 on no broad, just describing basic dating. Like, it's worth that to hook up once. Movement among younger people. And as a result of this,
there's
a lot of younger people.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'd love to hear your take, but just like that comment, like, I'm not spending $200 and then having to submissively go down on a woman. You see like a lot of people describing the most normal things imaginable, and this is true for women as well. Like, that's just a date, a successful one at that, is as abusive and horrible. Like, they can't figure out how to mate anymore. They spend all their time on their phones like panda bears. It's really bizarre.
I was just going to say that I run into a lot, because there's a lot of overlap between like the gender critical feminists with the anti-porn. They seem to, a lot of them share that view. And then what, a lot of the times I see like it's their answer to everything. Like if something they see online, they're like their go-to is like, oh, this is because of porn. Like, this just contributing to this societal ill or whatever.
I guess
I've noticed it a lot more now.
I'm so far out of the loop. I just don't pay any attention to the sexual stuff at all. It just really doesn't interest me. But that's completely bizarre. But I do think, from the very little I have seen, I wonder if there's a causal relationship between people being on their phones constantly, being incels, not having sex, not knowing how to approach a woman or a man for that matter. But I would assume, I could be certainly wrong. I don't move in that space, but
no.
Primarily among men, or the majority among men. Okay. Well, Wilfred, thank you very much. Christina, thank you very much. And once again, Christina, where can people find you?
I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Buttons Lives, and I have a Substack, buttonslives.news, where I report on gender medicine and new studies.
Buttons, I love that. And that's your real name. It is that's your real name, your birth name.
It's my name.
Okay, well, that's good. It's good. I love that name. And Wilfred, once again, people can find you where?
You can find the easiest way to find me. Oh, I didn't finish this because of the Elon thing. I'm Wilfred Reilly. It's WILFRED REILLY. Just look me up. You'll find my Twitter, old Facebook, sort of put together website, and most importantly, all my books, articles, journal articles, other content.
Yeah, I very much enjoy your writing, and I thank you for it, and it accords with my own, even though I don't consider myself a conservative. Classical liberal, I think, would fit more in that meld. But thank you. Thanks, Christina, for joining us. Keep your cameras on, keep everything on, and thanks again to Reed for helping out, and we really appreciate you coming on the show, Wilfred. Thank you. Thanks, Reed. Thank you for watching. Everything we do is under the umbrella of the National Progress Alliance, nationalprogressalliance.org. It's a nonprofit, independent 501c3. Your generous donations keep us going and keep fueling content like this. So please help us out. Make a donation. We very much appreciate it. Thank you.